Kirby Air Riders is officially the first Switch 2 holiday game. Considering Kirby Air Rides' underwhelming sales, a sequel seems like a risky choice. But Nintendo specifically requested this from Sakurai and gave it the most important release date of 2025. I think it's a huge bet that will set the tone for this generation. Released on the Nintendo Gamecube in 2003, Kirby Air Ride was Masahiro Sakurai's send-off project for the character he originally created. Ironically, it ended up being his final game as a HAL Laboratory employee as a direct result of the constant pressure he felt the industry was placing on him to make sequels. And it didn't even end up being a particularly well-received release at the time, as critically it received rather mixed reviews and commercially it ended up selling well under 2 million units, although in fairness that did manage to just barely place it in the top 25 best-selling games on the platform. That said, history did end up favoring Kirby Air Ride, with the easiest positive to point to being its dedicated cult following that embraced its city trial mode as an esport. It's nothing when compared to other Nintendo esports like Smash, Splatoon, Pokemon, or even games you may think are less suited like Mario Kart, but it, alongside the general word of mouth from people that are passionate about the GameCube era, was at least enough to build a bit of curiosity for the concept amongst people that haven't played it. But even that in a vacuum can't explain why Nintendo is making this decision, in my opinion. So if not word of mouth for a game that fans ended up loving in spite of its critical and commercial success initially, why pick that game? Not only as a candidate worthy of creating a sequel for over 20 years later, but going through the trouble of commissioning Masahiro Sakurai as an independent contractor to return to direct it and then place it in a primetime spot for their fiscal year, a time Nintendo themselves have said on record accounts for the lion's share of their annual profits? This is a question I myself have been asking for a while now. Since the day I unboxed my Nintendo Switch 2, I've wondered what game Nintendo would position as their first major holiday title. After all, the games they prop up in this way tend to perform significantly better than every other game by a pretty significant margin, and they tend to be entries in their largest franchises. It feels weird to have a game like Kirby, let alone a sequel to Kirby Air Ride specifically, being positioned as the strongest option for that pivotal release date. For a long time, even though we already knew about the existence of Kirby Air Riders for most of 2025, and even knew it was slated for a 2025 release, I wrote it off as a holiday title due to the original game's subpar commercial performance. That said, Nintendo clearly sees something more. They know how the game's shaping up. They surely have internal estimates of its potential commercial and critical reception, and if recent comments from Shigeru Miyamoto are anything to go by, I think it's safe to assume they see Kirby Air Riders' potential to be a 20+ million unit seller, since that's a stated goal of theirs to try to secure. If not for the holiday title, when else would you secure a game like that? If I had to guess, I'd bet the main thing Nintendo is banking on is the parallel increase of star power for both the Kirby IP and Masahiro Sakurai himself, something that has been accrued in the years since the original Kirby Air Rides release, with the bigger of those two stories absolutely being Sakurai's meteoric rise as a public figure in gaming. And that's saying something because he was already a bit of a known commodity at the time of Kirby Air Ride's release. Super Smash Bros. Is largely responsible for Sakurai's place in gaming. We can just be frank about that. People enjoy his other games, to be sure. I, for one, think Kid Icarus Uprising is a top 5 3DS game, and I think he's plenty charismatic and knowledgeable on all things gaming. His YouTube channel is nothing short of inspirational. But we'd be kidding ourselves to say any of that has done anything close to what Smash has in helping Sakurai achieve this mythical status the internet at large has given him, for better or worse. Sakurai is at a point in his career where hundreds of thousands of people, maybe even millions, very well may buy a game simply because of his involvement, in the same way people would for creators like Shigeru Miyamoto or Kojima, or much in the same way that film works. I don't think that alone will make this game Switch holiday blockbuster numbers worthy, but it's definitely a better starting point than the original game got. But again, it's not just Sakurai. Kirby itself has had a considerable increase in clout as well since Kirby Air Ride's release. Some of that was the international run of the anime. More of it was subsequent game releases across the franchise that have happened between now and then, and most of it, I'd say, is the most recent major release in the franchise, Kirby in the Forgotten Land, in particular, which is the direct result of another phenomenon that I think we need to get into to figure out if one, Air Riders has what it takes to replicate a Switch era tactic, and two, how Nintendo will likely evolve the strategy to grow other games and franchises in similar ways as we get further into the Switch 2 era. Most major Nintendo franchises that made their way to Switch 1, a decent amount of which were previously dormant, relatively niche franchises, all saw increased sales, to put it modestly, all-time best sales more often than not, and that was true from the moment the console was released. Zelda, for instance, has always been viewed as a major Nintendo franchise, but it hadn't truly earned that distinction in my mind until the release of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and later Tears of the Kingdom solidified it as the first instances of that brand netting Nintendo blockbuster level numbers without the asterisk of multiple ports across decades of consoles like the examples people previously presented as proof of Zelda's star power. Kirby is similar in the sense that it's been a pillar to the Nintendo community, and to the uninitiated might as well be a blockbuster level franchise, but it too hasn't really been able to come close to that 10 million units sold figure. Funnily enough, the closest Kirby contender to that milestone is Kirby in the Forgotten Land at just over 7 million units sold at the time of this video's release, and it still may very well get there with its Switch 2 edition release, but that would absolutely place it in the Ocarina of Time category I mentioned before at that point. I say all of this to say, not only has the original Kirby Air Ride gained some level of a cult following and is generally respected in the Nintendo community, but the Kirby franchise overall is a lot bigger than it was when that title released. And it's not just that either. The platform it's being released on is a much healthier springboard than GameCube was for Air Ride. Just that fact alone guarantees Kirby Air Riders will at a minimum double the original sales. That said, Switch 2 isn't Switch. It's selling well, currently faster than any other console before it, but it's not currently holding a candle to the well over 150 million units Nintendo Switch 1 has sold to date. We can't say for certain that it will have the same kingmaker effect, and there are a few valid reasons to doubt it ever will. The first layer of this effect in the original Nintendo Switch's unique appeal was its distinction as a portable way to play games that weren't previously available in such a convenient form factor before. Fast forward to 2025 and there's a laundry list of Nintendo Switch wannabes. The first thing hardcore gamers online are liable to tell you when considering getting a Switch version of a game in the last few years or so would be to just get a Steam Deck, or maybe an MSI Claw, or a Legion Go, or
3 hours later.
And while this could all very well change with the rogue Xbox Ally, the Switch 2 absolutely remains the most convenient and consistent way to play when compared to PC handhelds, and most consumers clearly feel the same given the fact that Switch 2 has already outsold the PC handheld frontrunner in its first few weeks on the market, and will likely eclipse that entire market, maybe even lap it in sales within the year. So I don't think this is a reason to doubt Switch 2's potential to be a kingmaker in the same way that Switch 1 was. Another potential reason is that, at least in the early days of Switch 2, the world at large is becoming increasingly expensive. Can't say for sure why. Call me crazy, but I think it has something to do with oranges and toupees and fragile egos. But that's just a hunch. Again, I don't know where that possibly could be coming from. At any rate, Switch 2 in terms of pure price tags is Nintendo's most expensive console ever, and the average price of software also increased. This is sure to impact its ceiling, potentially for the first 4 years of its life at least, But that's not to say its potential ceiling is negatively impacted by the original Switch and the way people assume. A lot of people seem to believe Switch 2 can only continue to outpace Switch 1 if everyone that bought Switch buys Switch 2 in that time period. In reality, the pool of potential consumers increases with time regardless of what Nintendo does, because that's how populations work. Also, it's important to note that while things are generally getting more expensive globally, that hasn't necessarily been true for Switch 2 everywhere, with the best example being the Japan only Switch that retails for less than $350 US. And it's also important to note that Switch 2 is still the cheapest modern console on the market. So Nintendo has maintained their distinction as the most approachable price point for families, despite, again, it being their most expensive console so far. That said, there are more niche negatives that gamers care more about than casual consumers, like game key cards, of course. But given the fact this video is about Nintendo IP, that's something that we can entirely ignore since they haven't used game key cards yet, and I personally doubt they ever will, because that is undoubtedly an option that exists to appease third parties. All of that said, I think Switch 2 could very well not only inherit the Switch effect, but I also believe it can put its own spin on it with its increased processing power, enabling developers to make more ambitious games, and Switch 2's increased focus on connection, giving an easy additional path for including and improving franchises that would benefit from better multiplayer features than Nintendo has previously had. Features like game chat will absolutely have an impact on Nintendo's dedication to online gaming, and that increased focus will have a ripple effect. Friend groups and even families will have additional reasons to invest in the platform as a direct result. There's a reason the biggest games in the modern era of gaming are massive online experiences. Nintendo is undoubtedly at least partially banking on their ability to build on the success of things like Minecraft, Roblox, and even GTA Online. I think this is another reason why their big holiday game is a game that is so multiplayer focused. You will see Switch My Way type trailers with a focus on playing Kirby Air Riders through game chat, for example. In the 45-minute long Kirby Air Riders Direct, Sakurai detailed a lot of the ways Air Riders iterates on the original game's formula, including, but not limited to, introducing more complexity to the control scheme, ballooning the roster of playable characters, increasing the amount of individual stars and star types, the scope of city trials, and so much more. I think adding this level of increased depth and overall scope will do a lot to make Air Riders feel like a substantial premium product where the original didn't quite get there. Like, the one-button racing game thing is cute and everything, and don't get me wrong, limitations in competitive games can bring about its own kind of complexity, but at the end of the day, the original control scheme led to a game that wouldn't cut it today for most people in terms of intrigue. On that note, I think it's also important to underscore how massive being able to easily play this game with people regardless of where they are in the world quickly and easily will be for this game's success. Many people are running with a narrative that all of this amounts to a game that is even a better value than Switch 2's current crown jewel, Mario Kart World. And while that definitely may feel true for the hardcore fans, I highly doubt that will actually be true for the casual audience. In other words, the vast majority of potential sales. I find it hard to imagine a world where Kirby Air Riders could even come close to outselling Mario Kart World, even if Switch 2 ends up having a particularly potent Kingmaker quality. That said, comparison in this way is fruitless, because unless you are very specifically Masahiro Sakurai or HAL Laboratory, it really doesn't need to be compared. There's space for both. We don't need to make everything a culture war. I promise Kirby Air Riders will be a success, even if I don't think it will be a Mario Kart level one. If I had to guess right now, I'd say Kirby Air Riders will shift at least 10 million units in its first year on the market, given all of the developments in the Kirby brand, Sakurai's increased cachet, the value of being on Switch 2 in this point of its life, and, well, simply not being on GameCube, potentially as high as 15 million, depending on the amount of Switch 2s in the hands of consumers. Are you one of the people people that has or plans to have a Switch 2 by November 2026, watch this video about another 2025 Switch 2 game you should play. Thank you to paid members over at shop.watchredirect.com like Trev L. Steinberg for making this video possible. Hit the link in the description to join them in the credits of every video and in receiving physical and digital perks.